Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your Cybersecurity Series. My name is Vlad, and I'm here to help you and support you in your cybersecurity journey, even if perhaps you don't have a technical background. Today, we start a brand new chapter in our Cybersecurity Series, and it will be dedicated to risk management. So, you will see that risk management is perhaps one of the most accessible domains within cybersecurity. There are a lot of professionals, just like myself, who are working on it on a daily basis, and it's basically putting away a lot of notions from traditional domains like safety, insurance, quality. And we will see throughout this series of videos how cyber has derived those notions and applied them to the modern computing systems, the modern IT systems, in order to develop a new competence, cyber risk management. So we are getting started with an important distinction today between three different notions, which are hazard, risks, and damage. And it's really important to distinguish in between the three of them because they are interconnected. And if you are misusing those words, it could actually have adverse effect on a job interview or when discussing with professionals. It's important to always have the right wording, the right terminology. So a hazard is essentially a potential source of harm. You have probably already heard about a fire hazard or the term a chemical hazard. These are basically examples. So it's a potential source of harm and it's an intrinsic property of a situation, a product, an activity that can cause adverse effects. So here I have listed three types of examples. It could be a sharp blade or cutting machine. It could also be toxic chemicals or harmful substances. And finally, a third example could be a defective electrical installation. On the opposite hand of the hazard, you have, of course, the damage, which is the actual injury or the negative impact that could be suffered by a person, but also by an IT systems or anything of value for a company. So here, of course, and also examples in the context of sharp blades or cutting machines, you could suffer physical injuries. You could get your fingers cut. You could also get some amputation. It really depends. In the context of toxic chemicals, you could get illness, of course, perhaps by inhaling certain products or poisoning. And finally, in the third example, in the case of a defective electrical installation, that could result in electrical shock, but also fire, perhaps to certain facilities or buildings, resulting then in injuries as well. And right in the middle of those two notions, this is where we have the risks. So the risk, it's important to understand that this is a theoretical event. It's a likelihood or a probability. Those terms are absolutely synonyms, and I might use one for the other, but you will always see both of them. It's a likelihood or a probability that a person will be exposed to a hazard and that harm will occur. So it's really the likelihood associated with the exposure to a hazard resulting in a damage. If there is no damage, then it's no point of talking about the risks. We really need to connect the two notions together. And of course, we will talk about the risk of cutting oneself, the risk of chemical exposure during handling or during manipulation, the risk of electrocution, for example, and in the context of cybersecurity, which we will discuss in the next video, of course, the risk of a cyber attack. But when we talk about the risk of a cyber attack, we will need to be really precise on what is the resulting damage and what is the hazard that we come into. And that's one of the specificities of cybersecurity. We don't really talk about a hazard. That's a small spoiler for the next video. We talk about threats because that if you go back to I think my second video on the difference between traditional IT and cybersecurity, here we are in the context of adversarial people that are trying to actively penetrate our systems or disrupt our operations. So that's what you should remember today. A risk is a theoretical, probable event. There is also a standard definition of risk. So if you know the ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization, they publish a lot of documentation. For example, the ISO 31000, which is dedicated on risk management. It also gives a definition on what is a risk. And a risk is defined as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So it might be a bit blurry for you, but don't worry, we are going to go through each of the terms. So basically, the effect. The effect refers to a deviation from the expected. So it can be positive or negative. So in the ISO, a risk can also be seen as an opportunity. And if you are working within a company, you will perhaps come across what they call risks and opportunities review boards or review committees, because sometimes in companies, risk is only for the negative consequences. And we talk about opportunities when the consequence is positive, of course. But anyway, those two go absolutely together. Then the uncertainty, it's the state where we don't really know what would be the consequence related to that event. And it's really something that we see also from the previous slide. A risk is something that is theoretical, and it can be quite hard to apprehend what would be the result, what would be the consequences, what is the probability of occurrence. Objectives, that is a broad term that is used here to just describe that it can be applied to basically anything. You can do risk management at the level of the company. You can do risk management at the level of the project or product or process or pretty much anything. So the objectives will have to be defined as per the scope of what you are looking at. So finally, and that's one of the conclusions of the ISO, one of the main pillars of the definitions is that the risk is characterized by two main elements. First one is the consequence, so the impact of on the damage, and the probability, so the likelihood of the risks to materialize. Important note, perhaps, when a risk materializes, so when the risk scenario that you have highlighted happens, we no longer talk about the risks, but we will talk about perhaps an issue, a problem, an important situation. But a risk is meant to be theoretical. So if it happens, then it's something different. When we talk about impact and likelihood, that's the final notion I would like to go through today. Basically, you will often come across risk matrices that are there to um, assess the significance of a risk. And we often use those two dimensions, impact and likelihood. The risks matrix can be a 3 by 3 matrix, can be a 4 by 4. Every company has its own different matrix or its own different ways of measuring risks, but the idea is the same. You often have different factors, so you can measure the likelihood or you can measure the impact with quantitative thresholds. For example, saying that an impact of 1 million euro is a major risk, but perhaps for a different company, 1 million euro is just a small risk. And then you have also quantitative measures or measurements for the likelihood. You can look at, okay, is the event happening once or twice per year, or is it something that we are facing on a weekly basis? So you can use those quantitative measures, but if you don't have those quantitative elements, you can also apply qualitative interpretations, say, well, medium, high, low, or I mean, low, medium, high in both cases. So here, this is what we have. We have low, medium, high, low, medium, high. So we have a 3 by 3 matrix. And when you will position your risk in one of the boxes in the grid, you can basically here understand what does it mean. So if we look at the bottom left first, we have a low probability and a low impact. So this can be, let's say, visualized by this small character that we have here. Basically, the idea is to go from point A to point B. And of course, it's not going to be a straightforward journey. Here we have a small obstacle. So as it is a low probability, we have a very small gap. So the probability that we will fall into the water is quite small. And the impact is also low because if we fall into the water, I mean, we are not going to die. As you can see here, it's a small step. However, if we move into the top left, we have a low probability, again, because the gap is quite narrow. So it's quite improbable that we will fall into the gap. However, we have a high impact because at the bottom of the pit, we have a lot of spikes. So if we fall, the impact will be significant, resulting in major injuries. Moving into the bottom right, here we have a high probability and a low impact. Low impact because it's water, again, we are not going to die from it, but a high probability because the gap here is quite significant, so it's very probable that at some point we will get ourselves wet. And finally, at the top right, you have the most extreme risks that is depicted here because it's a high probability. The gap is super huge, so it's unlikely that you are going to jump to the opposite end. And it's a high impact because we have, again, the spikes at the bottom, so resulting very likely in very high injuries. So this is the type of matrices that we use, and this is just an illustration of what it can look like. Of course, you can apply that to cybersecurity, and that will be the topic of the next video. I just wanted to highlight that. I think from a safety standpoint, that's perhaps what people think first. But I hope you enjoyed it. This is the very first video on this new risk management series. Stay tuned and see you soon in the next video. If you have questions, as always, don't hesitate. I will answer them in the comments. See you soon.